In 2012, I went through a very rough breakup with my boyfriend of around 18 months. You know that old saying, you live by the sword, you die by the sword? Well, our relationship was like that. Only instead of a sword, there was a lot of drugs and alcohol. He was a party animal, and at first, I found that very attractive. But after almost 2 years of fighting and struggling for money while nursing hangovers, I realized that I wanted to mellow out, while he didn't want anything of the sort. I didn't want to be that lame, controlling girlfriend. I wanted him to live the kind of life that felt right. I just wasn't going to let us slowly drift apart when we'd be much happier pursuing relationship goals with alternative partners. And that's the way I saw things anyway, but he disagreed. Like I said, the breakup itself was rough. There was yelling, there was tears, but in the end, he seemed to accept my decision and agreed that we'd be happier seeing other people. I also explained that I wanted to end things on a high note and that I didn't want my final memories of him to be tarnished by anything negative. That's what really seemed to make it through to him, and after that, everything seemed fine. But then came the night that he drove over to complete the ceremonial exchanging of stuff. I'm pretty sure that a lot of you know what I'm talking about. If you've been seeing someone long enough to have frequent sleepovers at each other's places, chances are you've left a whole bunch of stuff over there. For example, a bunch of skincare stuff to keep in his bathroom so I didn't have to carry a makeup bag to and from his place. Then, factor in that I have to buy this expensive Korean skin cream that literally has snail slime in it, look it up, and you can see why I was so desperate to get it back. Now anyway, so I've been texting my ex back and forth for a few days, organizing the exchange, making sure we're not forgetting anything so it's a one-time thing and we can make a clean break. He agrees to come over to my place once we'd both finished work. Then when I got home, I bagged up all of his stuff and waited for him to arrive. He told me that he'd be at my place by no later than 7. But then 7 turns to 7:30 and there's no sign of him. I texted him to ask where he was, but got no reply, so maybe like 5 to 10 minutes later I start calling him, and after getting his voicemail a few times, he finally picks up. He didn't sound like he was in a particularly good mood, but all that indicated to me was that he was sober. He told me that he'd gotten caught up in a few things and that he'd be over by around 8:15. All I did was ask him not to be too late, as I had to work the next morning. He hung up, and then I went back to waiting. Finally, just before 9, he buzzes my apartment, and I let him upstairs while I waited near the door with his bag of stuff. It took him slightly longer than usual to make it to my door, but then when he does, and I open it, I could smell the stink of booze on him, and right away that gave me bad vibes. He had a shopping bag with what looked like my stuff in it, so that was a good sign, but I had also explicitly asked him to stay sober for the exchange because I knew what it might lead to. I say I knew what it might lead to, but that's not strictly true. I figured it'd get emotional. I just never have guessed that he'd take things as far as he did. So, first thing I say when I opened the door and smelled the booze on him was a reminder that he'd promised to make the exchange sober. He just brushed it off, asked if he could come inside, but I said no, that I preferred just make the exchange and leave things at that. He started asking me, "Really? This is who you are now?" And I very politely reminded him that if he couldn't conduct himself like a grown-up, then he wouldn't be getting his stuff. It was a huge bluff on my part because I really wanted my stuff back, but I also didn't want to give him the impression that he could keep dictating terms outside of our relationship. I remember taking a step back from the door and getting ready to close it, then after giving him one last chance to just give me my stuff back, I attempted to gently close the door in his face. His response was to shove his foot in the door to keep it from closing. And then, after barging it open so hard it actually frightened me, he walked down the hallway of my apartment and into the TV and kitchenette area. My apartment door was still wide open as I started yelling at him like, "What the F do you think you're doing? Get out of here." But he didn't listen. He just marched into my kitchenette area where there was a small dining table, then slammed the bag of my stuff down on it. Then as he took a seat, he demanded that I come talk to him about the breakup so he could get some final closure, as he called it. I held firm, refused to even follow him into the kitchen, and kept demanding that he leave before I called the cops. But that's when he seemed to completely lose his mind and started literally screaming at the top of his lungs. "Do you want to kill me? Because that's what you're doing here. You're killing me." By the time he started freaking out and screaming, I was already on the cusp of dialing 911. But when he walked over to my knife block and pulled out the biggest one he could find, I realized things were way beyond negotiating and hit call after tapping 911. I also rushed back towards the front door to my apartment for several different reasons. First off, I had a pepper spray in my jacket that I kept on the hanger, like out of sight in case I needed to use it on an intruder, and so the first thing I did was grab that. But now I'm outside my apartment in the hallway with the door wide open and my ex sitting at the kitchen table. So if I need to, I can run down the hallway and out of the building and not risk trapping myself in the apartment with him. I'm also talking to the 911 operator by then too, all the while my ex is screaming at me to get off the phone and come back inside. But since he still had that carving knife and a white-knuckle grip, there was exactly 0% chance of me heading back inside. The next thing, I was giving the operator the address of my apartment building when my ex started walking toward me, out of the kitchen and into the hallway. I obviously wanted to keep out of stabbing range, so to speak, so I remember rushing down the hallway toward the elevator and stairs, then stopping to check if he was following me. My ex was following me. He'd come out of my apartment and into the hallway, but when I turned around in that split second and he saw that he had my attention, he stopped walking, turned the knife, and started to stab himself in the stomach. It looked like the knife was going deep, but not all of it went into his stomach every time he stabbed. I guess it was like lots of quick, shallow stabs, but from the horrible sound it was making, I could tell he was really hurting himself. I think that lasted maybe a second or two. I saw him doing it really, really fast, then I just turned and ran screaming down the stairwell instead of taking the elevator. He didn't shout anything after me, or if he did, I didn't hear it. All I could hear was those grunts of pain as he stabbed himself again, and again, and again. Then I started screaming, and I didn't hear anything else after that. I remember taking my phone away from my ear as I ran down the stairs because it felt like I might lose my balance if I didn't. But then, I was so scared that I kept trying to tell the operator what was going on, and that resulted in me running down the stairs screaming, "He's stabbing himself, he's stabbing himself. Someone call an ambulance, he's stabbing himself." I ran all the way across the parking lot of my apartment building before bringing the phone back to my ear, and I kept talking to her as I waited by the street that I knew the cops would come down. I remember begging the operator to tell the EMTs to hurry, that my ex was really hurting himself to the point where I thought he might die. She did her best to try and keep calm. Then the next thing I knew, I saw the cop car and I started frantically waving at them to flag them down. One of the other things I remember is how as I let the cops into the building with my key fob, I kept telling them, "Please don't shoot him, he's trying to hurt himself, so please don't shoot him." The cops completely ignored me, I guess because they were focused on their job, but in the moment, their silence had me even more panicked, thinking, "Oh God, he's still going to be holding that knife and he's not going to drop it, and they're going to kill my ex-boyfriend right there in the hallway outside my apartment." They didn't shoot him, thankfully. He was just lying there bleeding, but by the time the EMTs arrived and got him into the ambulance, which was at least an hour after he stabbed himself, I was totally convinced that he was going to die. Thankfully, some of my neighbors had emerged from their own apartments to see what all the commotion was, and were there to give me the consolation I so direly needed in that moment. Another thing to be thankful for was that my ex survived his self-inflicted wounds, although he did need a bunch of different surgeries to repair all the damage he'd done to his stomach or intestines. I thought the whole experience might sober him up, but the last I heard, he'd gone right back to his old self after maybe a year on the wagon. It's a shame, really. The guy had a lot of potential, and I wish he'd gone and made some better choices in life. But as I said earlier, if he's living the life he wants to live, then I'm happy for him. Happy to be apart from him also, but happy for him, nonetheless.